Hi, Scott.
Yep.
Hi, it's Adam.
Hey, Adam.
How are you?
I'm good. How about you?
Good, good. How do I sound? Do I sound okay? In the last, I don't know, year or half year, I've been very immersed in old Hollywood again, so
Sure.
it's been great. All right, well, let's set this up since we're talking already. Currently for sale, where books are sold or downloaded, is Scott Eyman's latest book, Hank and Jim, The 50-Year Friendship of Henry Fonda and Jimmy Stewart, published by Simon Schuster. I read it, and it was a thoroughly enjoyable read, deceptively light in the sense, but a lot of it is actually still with me weeks later.
Sounds good to me. That's a nice mixture.
Yeah. Well, you have a knack, if I can say that, where you're taking these great Hollywood figures, besides just humanizing them, you're really giving us the more complicated nature of these two guys that, and in no way takes away from them. Like, for instance, you could talk about it better than I can, but we all knew Henry Fonda had a occasionally contentious relationship with his children, but now I kind of have a much deeper understanding of why that might be.
Okay, good. Well, you want to try to create a true picture, so that the reader feels they know that person or those persons, without embroidery,
Yeah.
What I try to do in all my books is create a kind of intimacy with the subject, a comfort level and an intimacy with the subject, so that you can see the person stripped away of affectations, if not behavior, but certainly of affectations.
Well, this is what, your 15th book or 14th?
15th.
15th book. Impressive.
One of these days I'll get it right.
Your goal is perfection.
Well, I understood Fonda on a kind of cellular level, and his relentless pursuit of perfection and his utter frustration at his inability to achieve it. I get it. That said, I think I'm a little bit more aware of reality, creative realities than Fonda might have been. This is a normal sized book. It's 390 pages or something. Generally, I write which is like a saunter on through the park for me. I generally write these 600-page behemoths that you could Alan Ladd could have stood on to look somebody right in the eye. And they're big, and they're ocean liners, and if you're constructing an ocean liner, there are going to be occasional issues where things don't go according to plan, and also the problem with writing long books is there's more chance to screw up. There's more chance you have more opportunities to make mistakes.
Well, that's true. Well, let's talk about not that so much, but about this particular book, because I know you've written some of these tomes, as you put it, about such people as John Wayne, Robert Wagner, Cecil B. DeMille, Ernst Lubitsch, John Ford, just to name some of them. But this time, instead of just doing a more conventional style biography, you rather took on a relationship, a friendship. And was that what you had in mind? Or, how did you
That was my original intent, and I stuck to it as rigorously as I could. There were times when I was writing the book when I would do a page or two, and then I realized, no, that's off topic. That's getting too much into the weeds of his career or Fonda's career or Stewart's career. And I wanted as much as possible to focus not on their careers, except as background to the friendship, as opposed to the conventional way of doing it, which would be to focus on their careers with their friendship as the background. But I wanted to keep their offstage personas in the foreground, as opposed to their acting personas. So luckily I kept that pretty much in mind, and whenever I went, I managed to avoid going too far off the highway I'd set out for myself.
Well, normally you'd think readers would just want you to stick to the typical Hollywood anecdotes, but you're right. I think with these two icons, you really had a little bit more, I think, leeway, a little bit more, room here, because first of all, there is so much out there about them, but they were so front and center in the American cinema.
Sure.
It is kind of like a great way into finding out more about them, as opposed to just recalling Hollywood anecdotes.
Well, it's a in pool. If you were playing billiards, this would be like a 3-corner bank shot. It's not a direct shot into the pocket. You bounce around a little bit, and then you tap the ball, and it drops in. Hopefully, it's a more circumspect way of creating a picture of someone's the essence and the meaning of someone's professional and personal life. And it was a book I hadn't written, and that actually was the big attraction. On the one hand, it was a book I hadn't written, and then after I thought about it for a while, I realized it was a book I hadn't read either, because most books about friendships between famous people are about politicians, Churchill or Roosevelt, or statesmen if you prefer, Churchill and Roosevelt, and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, that kind of thing. But nobody had ever written a book about an intimate friendship between two movie stars. And I thought, well, now that's interesting. And also two movie stars that were so deeply in the American grain. You couldn't mistake Fonda or Stewart for anybody but an American. And their acting styles as well. And their personas as well. So I just thought it would be an interesting way to analyze a couple of American lives.
Not only that, but in this particular case of these two guys, you had the additional benefit. I think it's a benefit. It may have made your job a little bit more challenging, but you have two guys on the surface. They're very different.
Mm-hmm.
Jimmy Stewart seemed to be more affable, and
affable's a good word. Up to a point. He was very pleasant to everybody, but very few people got in. They were both beneath the surface differences. Underneath that,
right.
They were a lot alike. They were both very shy.
Yeah.
And they didn't really mix well. Stewart had an outward Midwestern politeness, but he was very superficial. Neither one of them had a gift for intimacy particularly, and neither one of them had or wanted a lot of people in their lives. They both liked to be by themselves a great deal, and to be with each other was one of the few. Each of them was one of the few other people that they could tolerate.
They didn't seem to mind the quiet space that they both thought. It seemed like they were both very comfortable, perhaps, and not everything had to be communicated in words, perhaps.
No, exactly. They didn't have to explain themselves to each other, because Stewart knew that Fonda understood him, and Fonda knew that Stewart understood him. So they could proceed to do the things they enjoyed doing together, which were boys' hobbies kind of thing, building kites and flying model airplanes, radio-controlled model airplanes.
Mm.
And, stuff that you don't think of 40 and 50-year-old men doing. But those are the things they enjoy doing. And it's not like neither of them had a childhood. There are men, of course, who don't have a childhood in any conventional sense. So it's that kind of stuff is understandable to something like that. But both these guys actually did have a childhood. So I think for both of them, it was a kind of return to innocence and a return to a pressure-free environment.
Yeah, they were both born in small towns, I guess you could say.
Yeah, Fonda was born in Grand Island, Nebraska, but he grew up in Omaha. The family moved to Omaha when he was a year or two old.
Yeah.
And Stewart was born in Indiana, Pennsylvania, and the family never left. And so died there. And if he hadn't gotten into acting, I'm sure he would have had to take over the family hardware store, and Jimmy Stewart's life would have been a lot like George Bailey's.
Yeah. Please, Mr. Potter.
Yeah.
It's hard to do Henry Fonda, isn't it?
Fonda's tough. It's a speech pattern, and it's very hard to duplicate.
Yeah. But Jimmy Stewart's is particularly, it's perfect for anybody who wants to try to do an impersonation.
Mm-hmm. Everybody does Jimmy Stewart at one point or another. Yeah.
Exactly. Even as an 8-year-old, I think I was doing a Jimmy Stewart impression, but
just get a laugh.
I'm not exaggerating. I grew up loving these guys, but I had no idea their friendship went back so far, that they really started from the very beginning of their acting careers. Their paths crossed in New York, correct? In the theater?
Yeah, it was 1932. They had briefly met in 1930 for a handshake. handshake and hello, how are you, and that was the end of it. Stewart was part of the university, Princeton University Drama Club, and hired Margaret Sullivan to come in and do a show for them. It was a young actress, of course, and Fonda was basically gobsmacked by Margaret Sullivan. I think he would be all his life. And he wouldn't let her out of his sight, which was probably a wise decision. And he followed her up to Princeton, to make sure that none of those Princeton boys seduced her.
Wise.
And it was a week show, and he was there for a couple of days, and he met Stewart, and they shook hands, and that was the end of it. They went back, and Sullivan and Fonda, Sullivan and Fonda were both part of a outfit called the University Players, which had been started by Joshua Logan and a friend of his, who also worked. And basically, it was a theater troupe in the style of the group theater, but without the heavy Russian navel gazing, And it was a group of young actors. Mildred Natwick was in there.
Oh, wow.
And Kent Smith was in there, and Logan was directing, and Brittain Windust was directing. And all these people actually had real careers, And Fonda was leading man, and Sullivan was leading lady, the ingenue, and Fonda was the man. And they fell madly in love, and they got married, and it blew up in the space of a few months, whereupon Sullivan went to Broadway, and her career was basically just a straight line up from the University Players to Broadway to Hollywood. And Fonda floundered, and he quit the University Players out of pique and depression. And at that point, Logan put in a call for Stewart to come and join them, who had graduated from Princeton with an architecture degree. Except he discovered he really didn't care about architecture particularly. What he really cared about was acting. And he had to tell, and he and Logan had to go tell his father, Stewart's father, who was a very domineering guy, that, oh, by the way, this degree you just paid for, it's going to be a plaque on the wall, and that's all it's going to be, because I want to be an actor. It was a typical conversation. But the old man finally consented, because they couched it as, well, we'll try it for the summer kind of thing. It's just a couple months, and if I don't like it, maybe then, So he agreed to that, and of course, I don't think Stewart had any intention of coming back to Indiana, Pennsylvania, and running the hardware store. So Stewart took over the juvenile roles that Fonda had been playing for the University Players, except Fonda was a much more romantic figure than Stewart. The University Players went belly up a year later, and then they're both in New York, starving, as young actors were doing in 1932. It's the pit of the Depression. And Logan and Stewart and Fonda all kind of banded together, and they got an apartment together on the site where Lincoln Center is now. And it was a kind of a dorm room thing, that people would come and go. Because you were always looking for a job, and if you got a job and it was out of town, you split, and someone else would come in. And whoever was working got the bed, and whoever wasn't working got the couch. So it was usually Fonda and Stewart. Occasionally Logan would be there as well. Occasionally Burgess Meredith would show up. Occasionally Myron McCormick would show up. Myron McCormick was a wonderful character actor. He was the original Luther Billis in South Pacific, and he plays Paul Newman's manager in the house. He's a wonderful actor. He died fairly young, but he was also part of their social group. And that's really where the bonding took place, the 3 years from 1932 to 35, when they roomed together. And then Fonda got the call to go to Hollywood. He'd had a Broadway success, finally. He'd been basically unemployed for a long period of time, but he got this show on Broadway that ran a little bit, and they decided to make a movie out of it and come and do the movie. So he left, and then 6 months later, Stewart left for California because MGM signed him to a stock contract. They weren't sure what they were going to do with him. They were never sure what they were going to do with him. But he had possibilities, so they signed him to, $100 a week contract with 6-month options, and if he didn't work out, they could let him go, and there wouldn't be a lot of money wasted. So they lived together in L.A., in Brentwood, actually, a rented place in Brentwood from 1935 to 1937, when Fonda got married to Frances, who's the mother of Jane and Peter Fonda.
And of course, we know what happened over time to Frances. She was
was mentally. It was a tragic. She had terrible depression. Crippling issues of depression that gradually accumulated until she committed suicide.
Yeah, obviously untreated mental illness.
It wasn't untreated. They did what they could for her. She was in and out of
maybe
numerous sanitariums, and mental health clinics.
I guess.
But there were no medications.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and then there wasn't a fraction of information as there is these days, of course. So, but it's interesting. Another thing, remembering as you recall his early days, Henry Fonda especially. This seemed like an accidental movie star. It was clear from the beginning that the stage was his first love. Again, something I can't say I knew, but he returned. I didn't realize just how many stage productions he did over the years, even once he was an established leading man. But it seemed like the stage was someplace he kept gravitating back to.
The stage was his natural habitat. He thought movies were all right, but they weren't by any stretch of the imagination. He didn't feel they were particularly creative because in a movie, there's so many people in between you and what you're trying to express. There's the director, there's the cameraman, there's the composer, there's the studio head, the editor. Any one of these people can gum things up, And whereas on stage, once the curtain goes up, it's just you and the audience. You're on your own to succeed or fail, given the fact that you're saying someone else's words. But basically, it's just you and the audience. So there's a direct connection, and he loved that direct connection. And he always, for instance, Fonda never really tried to screw a lot of money out of the studios. His price for a movie stayed the same for 20 years, and he was perfectly happy with that because he didn't have his eye on the next movie. He had his eye on the next play. I mean, he abandoned Hollywood in 1947 to go to New York. He lives in New York until 1963 or 4.
Amazing.
And he would go back to L.A. to do a movie for the money, and there's some good movies in there. I mean, 12 Angry Men, although that's shot in New York. But he would go back and do a movie once in a while. But his focus and his concentration and his self-respect was tied up in the theater, not in movies.
How did he ever agree to do Once Upon a Time in the West?
He thought it would be fun. Eli Wallach, he was friends with Eli Wallach. He got the script for Once Upon a Time in the West, and it didn't read well because it was a literal translation from the Italian script, and it read stilted. But he knew Eli Wallach had done a picture with Sergio Leone, and he knew Wallach because Wallach was a theater actor in New York, before he went to the movies. And Wallach always lived in New York, so they saw each other all the time. So he called Eli Wallach and said, "I got this script from this Leone guy." And Wallach said, "Don't say anything else. Just go. Just go. You'll have a wonderful time. You'll eat better than you've ever eaten in your life.
True.
Just go. I promise you'll have a great time." And he did. He had a wonderful time playing this cold-blooded, sadistic killer. And Jane told me, she said it was one of the few times he ever surprised me as an actor.
Yeah.
Was the fact, A, that he did it, and B, that he's so good.
Well, and it's interesting because she had such a difficult relationship with her dad, made all the more difficult because he was so beloved by moviegoers in the country. So here, how do you say, well, he could be very cruel, he could be very removed and withdrawn, he could hold.
He was aloof.
And he withheld his love.
Absorbed, right? And he was worried about the next performance. He was thinking about his next performance, how to rebuild by how to do the scene.
Yeah, he put career first.
As Joshua Logan said, he's a priest, and his church was acting.
Yeah,
and he put his profession first, and his family had to make do with what was left over. And that's not an unusual transaction for artists, for serious artists. It's fairly common. They don't define themselves as spectacular husbands and fathers. They really don't. Mm-hmm. They define themselves by the profession.
Yeah. Usually that comes way later in their lives, if at
all.
No,
he was like that when he was 25. He after Sullivan, who, and I didn't want to overstress this, but the three of them had a kind of Jules and Jim thing going on.
Sure, it sounded like that.
And it was the best part of their lives on some level. And I mean, I don't have any definite proof that the relationship between Stewart and Sullivan was sexual, but it wouldn't surprise me at all. Okay, because Stewart's letters to Sullivan are far more emotional and open than his letters, generally speaking, were. He was not someone who went around with his heart on his sleeve, Stewart, but he was very, very open and emotional when dealing with Sullivan.
Sidebar. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Finish. Go ahead. And she what?
Yeah, and I'm sure they never discussed it because it would have been a sore subject with Fonda. Because as
Yeah.
You know.
Where
On the other hand, if she was going to be with someone, I'm sure Fonda would have been Stewart than someone she liked.
Now that's the definition of a true friendship, right there.
That is a true friendship, and there aren't too many of those.
No. Where are these letters, by the way? You just mentioned Jimmy Stewart.
Stewart's letters to Margaret Sullivan are in her papers at the Lincoln Center Public Library. Public Library, Lincoln Center, the Performing Arts Library.
Yeah, sure, I know where it is.
That's where her papers are.
By the way, after we're finished in a little bit, I say goodbye, stay on the line because I want to tell you a thing I've been working on forever. Not actively, but I think you might be interested in. Again, we're talking to Scott Eyman, who is the author of a fabulous book about friendship. It's called Hank and Jim, The 50-Year Friendship of Henry Fonda and Jimmy Stewart, published by Simon & Schuster. This is also one of the longest friendships, it seems. I mean, since they were there, I think is it true, was it Henry Fonda died first?
Yes, yeah, well, it was 1932 to 1982. Fonda died. That was the year Fonda died.
So 50 years. Yeah.
Right after he did On Golden Pond, and he did a little TV movie after On Golden Pond. But then his health was already faltering at that point. He had trouble, and it was a slow diminishment, over the last 3 or 4 years of his life.
Mm.
But he was in shaky health at the time he did Golden Pond.
Yeah, that was apparent.
The last thing, yeah.
If you look hard enough, I guess. We talked about Henry Fonda and how he had these great gaps where he wasn't doing films because of his theater activities. Uh-huh. And, you look at just how robust his filmography is. Because I know that back in the day, the studios would be working these guys, like nonstop. But it's also surprising if you know Jimmy Stewart's military career or chapter, just how long he was missing from the movies in the prime of his life, you could say.
Oh yeah, he was in the service for 4 years. I mean, that's forever in a movie to be off the screen. That's 4 years is forever in the movie business, because the movie business is it's like the fashion business. It changes constantly, it mutates constantly, and what's hot one year might be ice cold 18 months later. So to be off the screen for 4 years, that's a long, long time, and he knew it. And when he got back to L.A. finally, after having some fun in New York with Fonda, after they were all both mustered out, he was very insecure and very unsure of himself, especially when he started shooting It's a Wonderful Life, because it was difficult. His muscles were gone. His acting muscles had been dormant for a long time, and he was insecure and shaky, and just had difficulty adjusting. And Lyle Barrymore helped him and gave him pep talks. And I mean, it took several weeks before he got his feet, his balance back as an actor. And it's understandable. It's understandable. We know a lot more about accumulated stress of the soldiers now than we did then. Whereas Fonda was frustrated and pissed off basically throughout the World War II, just as he'd been frustrated and pissed off in Hollywood since 1935. That was his natural state, but Fonda, I think, was fully formed as an actor before World War II. The Young Mr. Lincoln and Grapes of Wrath and the Ford pictures he was making. He was all there as an actor. Stewart was still growing, and I don't think Stewart achieved his apotheosis until after the war, because I think his service and his commanding a B-24 bomber crew and then having his own unit, flight unit, that was the making of him. Because growing up in Indiana, Pennsylvania, there's not a lot of stress. There's not a lot of anxiety. You've got the anxiety of your profession as an actor.
The word,
but that's a different kind of anxiety that I might die today.
Yeah.
The worst thing that can happen is the audience walks out. That's not getting killed.
The word anxiety hadn't made its way over to Pennsylvania yet.
No. But I mean, given his war experiences, he had more. He certainly had more than a nodding acquaintance with fear and anxiety by the time he got out of the service in the end of 1945, and he was able to access that, and it was a reservoir of emotion that he could always draw from. Mm-hmm. Whereas before it involved more acting, But after this, it was easy to access those feelings because he had them, bury them.
Mm. So anything that kind of caught you off guard or surprised you? I'm actually very curious about that because...
Well, there were little things. I would talk to the children. I talked to all the children.
Okay.
Fonda's, Jane and Peter Fonda, and Stewart's 3 children. And, Kelly, Stewart's daughter, would talk about what a terrible driver he was. And he was slow and indecisive. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, that is such... It's just a real mind stretch.
He drove like he talked?
You'd think a guy that could fly a B-24
right.
for 20 missions isn't going to be fazed by driving a car on the 101.
Yeah.
But no, he was a terrible driver.
Wow.
So, little things like that actually are kind of humanizing details.
Yeah, that's funny.
And he liked white food. He liked white food. A filet of sole, vichyssoise, vanilla ice cream. That was his perfect meal for years. Mm-hmm. The same thing. He was a guy in a deep groove, and he would eat the same meal for 10 years, and then he'd switch, and he went through this period where he only ate white food. And he drove a Volvo for more than 10 years because even though it was a beat-up car, it had plenty of headroom, and he was 6'4". So he was more interested in driving comfort than he was in having a Rolls-Royce or, a Bentley. Even though he's probably the richest movie actor of his generation. Mm-hmm. Because Stewart was very interested in financial security and very good about money. Whereas Fonda was always looking to, work for $1,000 a week in the theater.
Yeah. Stewart was a lot shrewder than you might take him for.
He was very shrewd. Yeah. He was very shrewd with money. Yeah. I mean, his friendships could be political friendships. I mean, Stewart's kids told me there were very few. It wasn't really a Hollywood upbringing, which is funny, given, they were raised in the heart of Beverly Hills. Mm-hmm. But there wasn't really a Hollywood. The only movie people at the house were Fonda and Lou Wasserman and a producer named William Fry. That was about it. Mm. There weren't any other movie people at the house. Well, if you're going to be friends with anybody in Hollywood, Lou Wasserman's a pretty good guy to be friends with.
Yeah, you don't need everybody else.
You don't need anybody else. Exactly. It's like being friends with Louis B. Mayer. It was okay. You were taken care of in that.
Yeah. Although I don't think anybody ever achieved that status of being friends with Louis B. Mayer, from what I understand.
Well, some were, okay. But it was tough. It wasn't easy. Yeah. But no, but Wasserman loved baubles like Stewart or Cary Grant at Universal. Because that's not what Universal was known for. Mm-hmm. But they were like little Tiffany charms they could wear in his bracelet and say, look, we have class too. Even though the business they were really in was not the TV business and not really the movie business. Universal was in the money business. But as long as you had Jimmy Stewart and Cary Grant doing a film once every other year apiece, you could at least hold your head up at a cocktail party.
Right. That's a lot of pedigree right there between those two actors.
Yeah.
Well, I urge people to get a copy of Hank and Jim. It's a very, very enjoyable read, and you'll come away knowing these two guys and Hollywood a lot more by the end of it. Well, do you have a next project figured out yet?
We're talking, but I don't know if you're talking about. We're just getting to the contract stage, so it's negotiating.
What's that?
We're just negotiating the next picture, the next book.
You don't want to, and nothing news breaks?
I don't like to talk about it until I'm well into it. It dissipates the momentum, I think.
I understand, and I can respect that. But maybe you'll come back on and break some news.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
That would be a lot of fun. Maybe we can do this in person too, at some point. Where are you located, by the way?
I'm in Palm Beach, the home of the Winter White House. He said, gagging.
Yeah, I just felt a little vomit in my mouth.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Where are you?
Yeah. Oh, I'm in. Right now, I'm in Brooklyn.
It could be worse.
It could definitely
be in Queens.
Yeah. Wait a minute. That's where I grew up. But you're right. Hey, it's such a pleasure.
Happy to do it, Adam. It's been fun.
I'm glad if we were able to pull it off.
Anytime.
I appreciate it. So stay on for a second.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Scott.